The forest was quiet in a way that felt heavy, like the kind of silence that presses down on you and makes your own breathing sound too loud. I had set up my tent not long before dusk, choosing a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and a few thick oaks. The air smelled sharp and earthy, the usual scent of damp leaves and pine needles that always calms me down when I'm out here alone. I was used to the solitude, to the way the woods feel like another world far away from the noise of cars and people. This was the kind of trip I took to clear my head, to be away from screens and the constant buzz of everyday life. I pitched my tent close to one large tree that immediately caught my eye. It wasn't the biggest tree in the clearing, but there was something strange about it. The bark had odd marks carved deep into it, almost like scratches or scars. At first, I thought maybe it was some animal or a weird natural growth pattern, but as I got closer, I noticed the shapes weren't random. They formed something that looked like eyes carved into the bark. The eyes were just gouges in the wood, but their shape was so precise it was hard to ignore. They weren't big, maybe the size of a human palm, and they had little slits inside that gave them the look of real eyes staring back at me. I stood there for a while, running my fingers lightly over the rough bark, feeling the grooves. The tree was old, its bark tough and cracked in places, but those marks looked fresh, as if someone had been there recently. I couldn't shake the feeling that the tree was somehow watching me, though logically I knew it was just wood and carving. Still, it gave me an uneasy feeling that lingered in my gut as I walked back to my tent to finish setting up. I made a small fire, just enough to keep me warm and cook some instant noodles. The flames flickered orange and yellow, casting shadows that danced on the trees around me. I kept glancing toward that tree every now and then, feeling like those carved eyes were somehow following me. It was stupid, I told myself. Trees don't watch people, but the feeling was hard to ignore. Night came fast. The woods grew darker, the only light coming from my small fire and the stars overhead, which peeked through the gaps in the thick canopy above. I zipped my tent closed, trying to get comfortable inside, but sleep was slow to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was there, just outside the thin fabric of the tent. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. The air was cooler now, and the fire had burned low to glowing embers. But what made me open my eyes was the sensation, like something was watching me, really watching me, from somewhere just outside the tent. My heart pounded as I forced myself to sit up and look through the mesh window. There it was, the tree. Only now the carved eyes looked different. They seemed wet, shiny like they had tears or some kind of moisture dripping from the carved slits. It was subtle but unmistakable. The eyes blinked, just once, slowly. My breath caught in my throat. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe it was the firelight reflecting weirdly, or maybe I was imagining it. But no, when I looked again, those carved eyes seemed alive. I could even see faint glimmers like tiny droplets of water clinging to the edges. I stayed frozen for a long time, staring at that tree. My mind raced, trying to explain what I was seeing. Maybe it was condensation collecting inside the carved marks, catching the light just right. Maybe it was the wind blowing moisture from the leaves onto the bark. But the blinking, that didn't make sense. Trees don't blink. After what felt like forever, the blinking stopped. The wetness disappeared, and the tree looked just like any other old tree in the forest. I swallowed hard, trying to calm myself. I told myself I was tired, that maybe the stress of being alone was messing with my mind. Eventually, the fire died completely, and I zipped the tent closed again. Sleep came in fits, haunted by the feeling that those eyes were still there, somewhere just outside. Morning came with the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, eager for fresh air and sunlight to shake off the heavy feeling from the night. I looked at the tree immediately. To my surprise, the strange carvings were gone. The bark looked smooth and normal, just like any other tree around. There were no signs of the deep gouges or the eye shapes I had seen the day before. It was like they had never existed. I circled the tree slowly, running my hands over the bark, searching for any sign of the marks. Nothing. No scratches, no carved eyes, no wetness, just plain bark. I even checked the ground around the tree, hoping to find something that could explain what I'd seen. Footprints? a tool, or any sign of human presence. Nothing. The forest was quiet except for the normal sounds of the morning. I packed up my camp quickly after that. Something about that tree unsettled me more than anything else I had experienced in the woods. I kept looking over my shoulder as I walked back toward my car, feeling like those eyes were still following me, even though the tree looked normal. The strange marks, the blinking wet eyes, whatever it was, I couldn't explain it. It didn't feel like a trick of light or my imagination, but I had no logical answer. As I drove away, I thought about everything I had seen. Maybe it was some kind of prank by other campers, carving marks into the tree to scare people. But who would carve eyes that looked so real and then wipe them clean by morning? Maybe the tree was damaged in some way I didn't understand, and natural processes made it look like it was blinking. But that still didn't explain the wetness or the sudden disappearance of the marks. In the end, I decided to accept that some things out here just don't make sense. The forest is old and full of mysteries, and maybe I had stumbled onto one I wasn't ready for. I don't believe in ghosts or spirits, but that tree showed me the woods have their own ways of reminding you that you're never truly alone. Even if it's just the trees watching, sometimes that's enough to keep you moving fast and never looking back. Since that trip, I haven't camped near that area again. I haven't seen anything like it before or since, and I hope I never do. Some things are better left unexplained, and sometimes the best choice is just to leave the forest behind and keep driving until the strange feeling fades. Because no matter how logical you try to be, sometimes the woods can make you feel like you're being watched, and that's a feeling I won't ever forget. The first night we camped near the old cabin, the woods were alive with the usual sounds. Crickets chirping, branches rustling in the wind, the distant call of an owl. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just me and my partner, away from the noise of the city. The kind of trip where you pack just the basics, a tent, sleeping bags, a small stove, and enough food to last the 2 nights we planned to stay. The place was remote, deep in a forest no one seemed to visit anymore. The cabin stood about 50 yards from our campsite, its wood faded and worn, half swallowed by moss and creeping vines. It looked like no one had been inside for decades. At first, the cabin was just part of the landscape, a strange relic that added a little mystery to the setting but nothing more. During the day, it was easy to dismiss it as an old hunting cabin or some abandoned ranger outpost. The windows were broken, the door hanging on rusty hinges, and the roof sagged under years of neglect. We didn't really think about going inside. Instead, we focused on setting up camp, building a small fire, and settling in for the night. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest changed. The colors dimmed, shadows deepened, and the cool air turned damp and sharp. We sat by the fire, sharing quiet moments and watching the flames flicker. Then, somewhere in the distance, the noise started. At first, it was faint, soft thuds and creaks, almost like the wind pushing against the cabin walls. But as the night grew darker, the noises became louder and more distinct, banging like something hitting wood, coming from inside the cabin. I tried to tell myself it was nothing more than the wind or an animal scurrying about, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It wasn't the kind of noise a tree branch would make rubbing against a roof. It was a steady banging, like someone or something was hitting the inside walls from the inside. Neither of us said much about it at first. The forest at night can mess with your mind. Shadows shift, sounds echo strangely, and it's easy to imagine things. Still, I lay awake, staring into the dark, the banging continuing in the background on and off until the fire died and the cold started to creep in. I remember feeling a chill that wasn't just from the cold air, something heavier. I could almost feel eyes watching us from the cabin, even though no one had come close. In the morning, the banging was gone, but neither of us slept well. When the sun rose, we packed up a bit of courage and decided to check out the cabin properly. During the day, it seemed less ominous, just an old, broken-down structure with a smell of rot and mold inside. The floorboards creaked under our feet, and dust floated thick in the shafts of sunlight coming through the broken windows. The air inside was stale and heavy, I noticed marks on the walls, scratches that looked too sharp to be made by animals. Some were long and deep, others shorter, as if someone had tried to claw their way out or signal something. The door at the back of the cabin was locked, hanging crookedly on rusted hinges, but the front door was open enough for us to step inside. It was while we were poking around the floor that I spotted it. A loose floorboard near the corner of the room, almost hidden under a thin layer of dirt and debris. I called my partner over quietly, and we started carefully pulling at it. The board came up easier than expected, revealing a small trapdoor beneath. It was about 2 feet square, the edges worn smooth from years of use, and it swung open on old hinges that creaked loudly. A rush of stale, cold air escaped when the door opened. The smell was overpowering: damp earth, decay, and something metallic. A narrow wooden ladder led down into the darkness. The opening was just wide enough for one person to squeeze through at a time. We didn't have any flashlights, but I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight app. The small room beneath the cabin was maybe 6 feet wide and 8 feet long, with dirt walls that seemed to close in around us. The floor was covered with loose soil, and scattered across it were bones, small and large, bleached white with age. Some looked like animal bones, but others were unmistakably human. There were also faded, torn photographs pinned haphazardly to the walls, curling at the edges and stained with dirt. Faces stared back at us. Men, women, and children who had been reported missing in this area over the last few decades. The pictures looked like they had been taken before their disappearances, some with dates scribbled faintly on the back. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This was not just an old cabin abandoned by time. This was a place where someone had been hiding things no one was meant to find. The bones, the pictures, it all told a dark story, one that no one had ever dared to uncover. We didn't speak, just looked at each other with wide, terrified eyes. Neither of us wanted to imagine what had happened down here, what kind of person could do something like this. I felt a rising panic, a cold knot in my stomach. Every hair on my body stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched, even though we were alone in the forest. We closed the trapdoor carefully, leaving it as undisturbed as we found it, and hurried back to the surface. The cabin seemed different now, more sinister somehow. The light outside didn't feel warm or comforting. The forest seemed to press in closer, the shadows deeper and darker. We packed up our gear as quickly as we could and left the campsite behind without a word. On the way back to the car, the woods were eerily quiet. No birds sang, no wind rustled through the leaves. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I kept glancing over my shoulder, sure that someone, or something, was following us. But when I looked, there was only the endless stretch of trees, silent and watching. We didn't stop until we were out of the woods and back on the main road. Even then, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me for hours, maybe even days. The images of the bones and the faded faces haunted my mind. What had happened in that cabin? Who had been trapped in that dark hole beneath the floor? And how many others had disappeared without a trace? We never went back. We never told anyone exactly where we had been. The cabin remained a secret between us, a dark memory carved into the back of my mind. Every time I close my eyes, I can see the faces in those photographs, and I hear the faint echo of banging coming from the darkness beneath the old floorboards. The forest was thick and quiet when we came across the campsite. It wasn't marked on our map, and none of us had seen signs of it before. We had been hiking for hours, pushing deeper into the woods than usual, following a narrow, winding trail barely visible beneath the thick layer of fallen leaves and pine needles. The trees stood tall all around us, their branches heavy with moss and damp from recent rain. The air was cool and smelled of earth and pine sap. It was the kind of place where everything felt still, as if the forest was holding its breath. We stumbled into the clearing by chance, the trail ending abruptly at the edge of it. The clearing was small, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by towering firs and maples. At first glance, it looked like any other campsite. But as we stepped closer, A sense of unease settled in. The tents were in bad shape. Some were torn into rags, fabric flapping in the gentle breeze. Others looked burned, their nylon sides blackened and melted in patches. The fire pit in the middle was cold, but the ashes looked fresh, gray and powdery with no signs of rain washing them away. Scattered around were bits of burnt wood and charred remnants of what might have been food wrappers or cooking utensils. Near the edge of the clearing, half buried in mud and leaves, we found a pair of small, worn children's shoes. They were old, muddy, and covered in scratches and grime, like they'd been trampled on or dragged through rough ground. It was strange to see children's shoes here, in such a rough, abandoned place. The shoes were too small to be adult, and their presence made the clearing feel colder somehow, even though the sun was warm on our faces. We all stopped and looked at them in silence. Nobody said anything. The forest felt heavy with something unsaid. The light was fading fast. It was getting close to evening, and we knew we needed to set up camp soon if we wanted to stay here. None of us felt comfortable moving on in the dark through unknown forest. So we picked a spot just off the clearing, not too far from where the shoes lay, and started pitching our tents. That night, after the fire was low and our camp was settled, strange sounds began. It started softly, light footsteps on dry leaves, faint giggles floating through the trees. At first, I thought it was just some wildlife or the wind moving through the branches, but the sounds grew clearer and more distinct. It was unmistakably the laughter of children. The giggles came from all directions, sometimes close, sometimes far away, but always surrounding us. There was the sound of running, quick and light, darting between the trees, breaking small twigs and rustling bushes. We grabbed flashlights and moved carefully through the woods, trying to see where the sounds came from. But no matter how far we walked or how loud we called, there was nothing to be found. No children, no footprints, no signs of anyone or anything that could have made those sounds. The forest was empty except for us and the silence that followed. It was eerie, the way the laughter echoed then vanished. I kept expecting to see a group of kids playing hide and seek, but there was nothing but trees and shadows. The night grew colder. Our campfire flickered weakly, barely pushing back the dark. The laughter came and went in fits and starts, always out of reach. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and we all crawled into our tents, uneasy and wide awake. Sleep didn't come easy. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. The children's laughter seemed to linger in my ears even when I closed my eyes. Morning arrived gray and heavy with fog. I was the first to get up, the damp chill creeping under my skin. The forest looked different in the pale light, less threatening but still strange. I walked over to the clearing and noticed something immediately. The children's shoes were gone. The muddy little shoes that had sat there untouched last night had vanished. There was no sign of them anywhere nearby, no footprints leading away, no dragged marks through the dirt. I searched around the clearing and the edges of the forest, but it was like they never existed. The ground showed no fresh disturbances, and the forest floor was smooth and quiet. I told the others, and they came to look too, but none of us could explain what had happened to the shoes. We packed up quickly after that. The strange noises had stopped, but the feeling of being watched stayed with us. As we walked back down the trail, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The forest seemed alive in a different way now, not just a place of trees and animals, but something else, something quiet and waiting. None of us spoke much on the way back. The memory of the shoes, the laughter, and the abandoned campsite hung heavy in the air. When we finally reached the edge of the forest and the trailhead where our cars were parked, the sunlight felt warm and safe. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about that campsite was unfinished. Like the forest was holding on to a secret it wasn't ready to share. I've thought about those shoes a lot since then. How could they disappear overnight with no trace? Why were they there in the first place, abandoned among burned tents and cold ashes? The forest doesn't hold many answers, but I know one thing for sure. The place was real, the sounds were real, and whatever left those shoes behind was still out there, somewhere in the woods, waiting for the next group to stumble in. It was late afternoon when I finally reached the small clearing nestled deep in the pine forest. The air was cool and sharp, carrying the smell of pine needles and damp earth. I had been looking forward to this solo camping trip for weeks. Just me, my gear, and the quiet woods. I set up my tent carefully on the soft ground, using the fallen pine needles as a natural cushion beneath. Around me, tall pines stretched toward the sky, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The forest floor was thick with a carpet of brown needles, broken only by scattered rocks and the occasional fallen log. I gathered some dry wood for a fire and arranged it in a small pit I dug near the tent. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees, I felt a peaceful calm settle over me. I was alone, sure, but it was the kind of solitude I craved. No noise from cars or people, just the sounds of nature. Birds chirping their last songs, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. By the time the sun disappeared completely, I had a small fire going, its orange flames licking the cool night air. I sat back on a log, warmed by the fire, and ate some canned beans I'd packed. The woods around me were dark now, the thick pines blocking out any moonlight. The only illumination came from my campfire and the faint glow of my flashlight resting nearby. It was just after I put out the fire that I first noticed something strange. At first, it was just the faintest sound. A soft murmur carried on the breeze, almost like a whisper. I paused and listened carefully. The forest was supposed to be quiet at night except for the usual sounds. Crickets, owls, the distant call of a coyote. But this was different. It sounded like voices. Quiet, soft, and clear enough to make out a word or two. My heart started to beat faster. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the trees around me, expecting to see some other campers or hikers. There was no one, just the tall, dark pines, their needles trembling in the slight wind. I called out softly, "Hello? Anyone there?" But my voice just disappeared into the woods. The whispers grew a little louder, and then I realized they were saying my name. Not once or twice, but repeatedly. A soft calling, like a low hum that seemed to circle all around me. The voices urged me deeper into the woods, just beyond the clearing where my tent sat. It was impossible to tell exactly where the voices came from. Sometimes they seemed just behind me, other times from the left or right, always distant but unmistakably clear. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I told myself it was probably just my mind playing tricks. The wind moving through the pine needles, maybe animals making strange sounds. I tried to ignore it and went back into my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay down. The soft whispering didn't stop. It seemed to press against the walls of the tent like it was trying to get in. The voices weren't angry or threatening. They were calm, patient, almost coaxing. But they made me nervous, uneasy in a way I hadn't expected. I grabbed my flashlight again and unzipped the tent to look outside. The forest was dark, shadows stretching long and thick. I shone the beam slowly around. No movement, no people, just the trees standing silent. The whispers continued, circling the clearing like a faint wind with a voice. I stood there for a long time, frozen in place. The whispers never got louder, but they never stopped either. I felt like I was being watched, but every time I shined my light toward the noise, nothing was there, just silence and shadows. I decided to pack up some of my things to be ready to leave if things got worse. The voices followed me every step I took, soft calling, always urging me to come deeper into the forest. I didn't want to, but the voices had a strange pull. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch, a part of my brain trying to convince me to leave the safety of my camp. At one point, I thought I saw movement far between the trees, just a quick flash of something slipping behind a trunk. My flashlight beam chased it, but it vanished. No rustle of branches or crunch of leaves followed. It was as if something had melted into the shadows. I sat back down by the fire pit, trying to calm myself. I kept the flashlight close, fingers tight around the handle. The whispers didn't change. I closed my eyes for a moment and tried to think about anything else. The stars above peeked through gaps in the pine canopy. The air was cold now, and the night was completely still except for the quiet voices. Hours passed this way. I kept glancing around, shining the light toward every noise, every crackle in the brush. The voices were patient, steady, relentless. They called my name again and again, soft and low. At one point, I remembered the stories I'd heard about how the woods can mess with your mind, how tired hikers sometimes hear things that aren't there. I tried to convince myself that's all it was, exhaustion and fear making me hear whispers where there were none. But even when I told myself that, the voices continued. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the whispering voices filled my head. They didn't shout or scream. They just kept calling, soft and steady, like a slow, sad song carried by the wind. Just before dawn, I packed my gear quietly and prepared to leave. The whispering voices followed me to the edge of the clearing but stopped as the first light of day broke through the trees. The forest seemed to exhale as the sun rose, the shadows retreating and the voices disappearing like they'd never been there. I didn't look back as I walked away. The pine trees stood tall and silent in the morning light, and the cool forest air felt fresh and safe again. I didn't stop until I reached my car miles away. I never went back to that clearing in the pine forest. I still don't know what those voices were or why they called me that night, but I know this. Some parts of the woods don't want you to stay, and sometimes it's best to listen and leave, even when you don't understand why. The morning was cold and wet as I started my hike into the forest. It was early, well before sunrise, and the world felt quiet and still in a way that only happens in the early hours. The fog had rolled in overnight, thick and heavy, wrapping itself around the trees like a blanket. Everything was gray and blurry, the shapes of the trees softened by the mist, their trunks disappearing halfway down into the fog. The damp earth beneath my boots was soft and squished slightly with every step I took. The air smelled fresh but wet, the kind of smell that comes from moss and fallen leaves soaking up the rain from the day before. I'd come to the forest to clear my mind, away from the noise of the city and the pressure of work. There was something calming about the woods, even in the early morning when the fog made everything feel like it was hiding secrets. The trail I followed was narrow and winding, lined with thick ferns and tangled roots. My breath came out in soft white puffs as I moved slowly, careful with my footing. My hands were in the pockets of my jacket, the sleeves pulled down to my wrists to keep warm. The usual sounds of the forest were muted by the fog. No birds singing yet, no squirrels rustling in the leaves. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I was about an hour into my hike when I saw it. A dark shape standing between two trees a little ways off the trail. At first, I thought it was just a tree trunk, twisted oddly or covered in moss that made it look blacker than the rest. But then I realized it was standing upright in a way a tree wouldn't. It was tall and thin like a person, and it didn't move, not even a flicker or a breath. It was just there, standing still, staring in my direction, or at least, that's what it felt like. I stopped walking and stared back, trying to make sense of it. The figure was too dark to make out any details. No face, no clothing, just a solid black shape that stood out sharply against the gray fog. It didn't blink or shift or make a sound. I called out softly, "Hello?" But the sound of my voice felt strange in the thick air. There was no answer, no rustle of leaves or footsteps, just silence. I thought maybe it was someone who had gotten lost or was hiding, but there was no movement. The fog seemed to thicken all around me suddenly, swallowing the trees and the figure in a thicker, heavier mist. I blinked, and the shape was gone, just disappeared like it had been part of the fog itself. I looked around quickly, my heart pounding, but there was no sign of it anywhere. The rest of the hike felt strange. The forest looked the same, but the fog was lighter now, and the sun was starting to rise, pushing warm light through the trees. When I finally reached the ranger station at the edge of the forest, I told the ranger about the figure. He looked at me with a puzzled expression and said no one else had reported seeing anything unusual that morning. The forest here was usually clear of fog so early, he said. It was rare for the mist to be that thick, especially so close to the ranger station. He suggested it might have been a trick of the light or the fog playing with my eyes. Maybe a tree or a dark shadow that I misunderstood. I wanted to believe him, but I knew what I'd seen. The figure wasn't just a shadow or a tree. It had stood there, watching me, silent and still, before vanishing into the fog. It was one of those moments that stayed with me long after I left the forest. Something real and strange that didn't fit any simple explanation. That day and the days after, I kept thinking about the figure. It wasn't a ghost or a monster, just a person or something like a person, but it felt wrong. I never saw it again, and the forest never looked as foggy in the early morning after that. But every time I pass that trail, I feel a shiver, remembering the cold, quiet fog and the dark shape standing still, waiting between the trees.